Storm-lashed ships cut across the North Atlantic on a medieval European expedition to reach the Americas well before Columbus. This isn't the well-known story of Leif Erikson. This is the tale of Henry Sinclair, the 14th century Earl of Orkney, who many believe voyaged to North America nearly a century before Columbus set sail. Was this Scottish nobleman truly an intrepid explorer who reached the New World in 1398? Or is it a medieval myth that has grown in the telling? Henry Sinclair was a Scottish-Norwegian noble born around 1345. As a teenager, he inherited the family titles of Baron of Roslin and the high office of Lord Admiral of the Seas for Scotland. His rise continued in 1379 when King Haakon VI of Norway invested him as the Earl of Orkney, now part of Scotland but then still under Norwegian rule. This title came with the charge of bringing the unruly Norse inhabitants of Orkney and Shetland under tighter royal control and defending them from threats. Sinclair proved to be an energetic lord. He built the now demolished Kirkwall Castle in Orkney as his stronghold, and by 1390 had solidified his hold on the islands. He even led a fleet of 13 ships to subdue rebellious Norse warlords in the Shetland Islands, restoring them to Norwegian authority. By all accounts, Henry Sinclair was an able military leader and maritime commander, well suited to bold ventures at sea. Despite his accomplishments in the north, Sinclair's life in the records appears relatively ordinary for a noble of his era. He governed his earldom and served his liege lords in Norway and Scotland. Around 1400, Henry Sinclair died, reportedly slain while defending Orkney from an English or Scottish raiding party. The earldom passed to his son, and with that, the historical chronicles of Henry Sinclair largely end. However, this is where his legend truly begins. Centuries after his death, Henry Sinclair's name would gain an almost mythic status. Today he's best remembered not for pacifying Orkney or building castles, but for a daring voyage that most scholars doubt ever happened. To understand how this Scottish earl became linked to discovering America, we must turn to the origins of the legend. The legend of Henry Sinclair's transatlantic voyage first surfaced long after the medieval period. It hinges on a mysterious document known as the Zeno narrative. This is a series of letters and a map, supposedly authored around 1400, but only published in 1558, by a Venetian named Niccolo Zeno the Younger. According to Zeno, he had discovered old letters in his family archives detailing a journey undertaken in the 1390s by his ancestors, the Zeno brothers, Niccolo and Antonio. In these letters, the Zeno brothers describe how they were shipwrecked on an island called Frislanda and rescued by a prince named Zicimini, whom they then served as navigators. Under Prince Zicimini's command, the brothers explored unknown western seas. The letters claim they sailed to Greenland, already known to Europeans since Viking times, and then kept going further west, encountering what appears to be the coast of the New World. They mention reaching a place beyond Greenland described as a fertile land, mild and pleasant beyond description. This is an area some speculate could be Newfoundland or Nova Scotia in North America. As you may have noticed, the Zeno narrative doesn't explicitly name Henry Sinclair, and Orkney is also absent from the letter. So how exactly did Henry become part of this story? The key is the enigmatic Prince Zicimini. In 1784, a scholar named Johann Reinhold Forster was the first to theorize that Zicimini was in fact Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney. Forster and others noticed that details about Zicimini, a great lord ruling islands in the North Atlantic and fighting battles in the area, could match Henry Sinclair's profile. Supporters of the theory assert that Zicimini is a garbled spelling of Sinclair, possibly a transcription error or translation of a title like Earl of Orkney. If Zicimini was Henry Sinclair, That would mean Sinclair partnered with the Zeno brothers on a 1498 voyage beyond the known world. According to the legend as it has evolved, Henry Sinclair's motive for exploration was spurred by both ambition and intriguing tales. One story tells of a fisherman who washed up in Orkney after being lost at sea for many years. This old sailor claimed he had been blown far west by storms to a strange land, with a mild climate and curious inhabitants. Greenland was already known, so if his story was true, it hinted at lands even further beyond. The adventurous Earl of Orkney, so the tale goes, became determined to find these lands across the sea. Sometime in the late 1390s, Henry Sinclair supposedly set sail with a fleet of ships, taking the Zeno brothers as navigators, and even a contingent of knights. They traversed the North Atlantic, passed Greenland, and made landfall in a new world. The Sinclair expedition of 1398, as legend describes it, saw the explorers reach what we now know as the eastern coast of Canada. Some accounts place their first landing in present-day Nova Scotia around Chedabucto Bay. In fact, a very modern monument in Guysborough, Nova Scotia, marks the alleged landing site of Prince Henry Sinclair on June 2nd, 1398. The party is said to have wintered in Nova Scotia and then ventured south along the coast the following spring. Henry Sinclair's band purportedly sailed as far as Massachusetts, and perhaps beyond. One tale describes Sinclair climbing a hill in what is now Massachusetts to survey the land, during which a skirmish or accident led to the death of one of his crew. Eventually, Sinclair supposedly returned to Orkney in 1399, intent on organizing a larger return voyage. However, these plans were cut short by his untimely death in 1400 before he could sail back to America. It's a breathtaking narrative, a Scottish-Norwegian nobleman exploring North America almost a century before Columbus, then taking the secret of the new land to his grave. But is there any evidence for this medieval adventure? Or is it purely a product of wishful thinking and later embellishment? Over the years, a number of clues and legends have been cited to support the Sinclair voyage. Before judging the plausibility, let's examine these pieces of evidence that make the Henry Sinclair story such a persistent historical mystery. Supporters of the Sinclair voyage theory have gathered a fascinating array of clues that, at first glance, seem to hint that someone from Europe could have been in the Americas around 1398. The cornerstone of the legend is the Zeno narrative itself. If authentic, these letters describe a voyage under a prince that matches Sinclair's timeline. The accompanying Zeno map depicts islands and perhaps parts of the New World as known to the Venetians. However, the credibility of this evidence is hotly debated. Most historians today suspect the Zeno letters and map were a hoax, or at least not entirely reliable. Still, for believers, the Zeno narrative provides the basic plot of Sinclair's voyage, and even notes that a cousin of Zichemini died during the expedition. This is a detail intriguingly consistent with other Sinclair legends about a fallen knight, which I'll get to shortly. Perhaps the most curious evidence is found in Rosslyn Chapel near Edinburgh. This chapel was founded in 1446 by William Sinclair, Henry's grandson, and it's famous for ornate stone carvings shrouded in symbolism. Notably, some carvings appear to depict plants like maize, native to the Americas, and supposedly unknown in Europe before Columbus. Some argue this is proof that knowledge of American flora came back with Henry Sinclair's expedition and was commemorated by his family. Skeptics counter that the carvings are stylized depictions of known plants like wheat or lilies, but the corn-like motif continues to invite speculation for very obvious reasons. In Westford, Massachusetts, there is a weathered rock carving that some believe is a medieval knight's effigy. In certain light, The rock shows lines that resemble a sword and the outline of a figure. Local legend calls it the Westford Knight, claiming it's a memorial left by Henry Sinclair's party for a fallen comrade. A nearby modern inscribed slab confidently identifies the figure as Sir James Gunn, a knight who allegedly traveled with Sinclair and died during the inland exploration in 1399. Sir James Gunn was a member of the clan of the same name, which has Norse-Scottish roots, and the faint carving is said to include a shape like the family crest. According to proponents, this matches the Zeno letter's note of a lost nobleman on the voyage, cementing the idea that the Westford carving is a medieval marker of Sinclair's presence. Critics, however, suspect the carving's supposedly knightly features were enhanced in the 19th or 20th century to fit the legend. Another piece of supposed evidence takes us to Newport in Rhode Island, where a mysterious old tower stands looking quite out of place. While most historians believe it to be the remains of a 17th century windmill built by early colonists, alternative theorists have other ideas. The Newport Tower's unusual architecture has led to speculation that it is much older, perhaps built by unknown pre-Columbian visitors. One theory claims that it was built by Henry Sinclair's expedition as a temporary fort or lookout. The tower's presence in New England, coupled with it looking incredibly out of place in Rhode Island, has made this tower another cornerstone of the legend. Notably, the indigenous Mi'kmaq people of Nova Scotia have oral traditions that some researchers have linked to the Sinclair voyage. One tale speaks of a visiting great chief from across the ocean who arrived with his men as well as his daughter. Supporters of the Sinclair theory see tantalizing parallels. Henry Sinclair was sometimes titled Prince or Chief, and he had a young daughter in the 1390s. It's highly speculative, but the story of a visitor fits neatly into the narrative of Sinclair's one-year trip in the New World. Over time, the Henry Sinclair legend tangled itself with the lore of the Knights Templar, adding another layer of mystery. An 18th century Masonic tale claims that some Templars fled to Scotland under King Robert the Bruce in the early 1300s to escape persecution. The Sinclairs in Scotland, according to these theories, became secret guardians of Templar treasures and knowledge. Henry Sinclair, living a few decades later, is cast as a Templar heir who may have carried sacred treasures west to a safe hiding place. This is where Oak Island in Nova Scotia comes into play. Oak Island is famous for its legendary money pit treasure, and some suggest that Sinclair and his supposed Templar comrades buried a cache of treasure there in 1398. While there's zero hard evidence linking Sinclair to Oak Island's mystery, the mere possibility ties the Sinclair tale into one of the greatest treasure hunts of all time. While there's a lot of evidence that appears to be compelling at first glance, to really assess whether it was plausible, we need to zoom out and conduct a broader analysis of the evidence. Unlike Christopher Columbus's well-documented voyages, there are no known contemporary records of Henry Sinclair sailing to a new land across the Atlantic. Sinclair lived in an era when significant deeds would likely have been noted in chronicles or letters. Yet no medieval document or account from Sinclair's time mentions such a voyage. The story only surfaces long after his death, which raises red flags. As one criticism goes, if Sinclair had truly found a new world, he would have been the first to have let the world know. I find this criticism somewhat unfounded, though, because if we're following the unofficial narrative, Sinclair was in the midst of preparing a second voyage when he perished. Discovering an entirely new world across the ocean is something that he may have wanted to keep under wraps until he could personally gain a foothold in the area. Another problem is that the primary source for the legend, the Zeno narrative, is widely regarded as dubious. Many historians believe the Zeno narrative was a Renaissance fabrication, or at least heavily embellished, possibly created to support Venetian claims, or simply as a literary hoax. Niccolo and Antonio Zeno were indeed real people who served Venice. However, historical records place them in Venice at all material times. To put it in context for all my EU4 players out there, the Zeno narrative could have been Venice fabricating a claim on a chunk of the New World. And yeah, if you're blasting along on Speed 5, I expect you to stop and comment right now because I'm talking to you directly. The idea isn't far-fetched at all, and Venice had seen a massive decline in its fortunes due to the extreme wealth being brought in from the New World. Venice had invested in serious quote-unquote colonial efforts, much like other European powers. However, the Venetians went all in on the Eastern Mediterranean, which turned out to not be the winning play in the long run. Having a foothold in the Americas could have massively boosted Venice's flagging fortunes, assuming this story was able to work itself into a claim in the Americas. Notably, it didn't, and historians can't be entirely sure what to make of the Zeno narrative, even though it's likely believed to be fabricated. Other critics point out that each piece of evidence offered by supporters can be explained without invoking a secret 1398 voyage. For example, the Rosslyn Chapel maze carvings could indeed depict something other than American corn. Art historians note they resemble stylized wheat or strawberries, common medieval motifs, though they are noted to be unusual stylizations if that's the case. The Westford Knight image could be largely natural or carved later by locals, rather than a 14th century Scottish knight's work. The Newport Tower is confidently dated by most experts to the 17th century, long after Sinclair. Further, oral traditions amongst native groups in Nova Scotia about visitors from afar could refer to Norse Vikings or be metaphorical with the details retrofitted to Sinclair's story. After all, it's important to note that we don't know when these oral histories date from or when they were first recorded. It's very plausible that the oral histories could have undergone a change through further contact with Europeans in the subsequent centuries. In essence, the two traditions could have melded together into one new oral tradition, which is now improperly cited as evidence for Henry Sinclair's voyage. Even the name Zicimini might not be Sinclair at all. It could be a fictional character or a composite of various explorers. After all, if the Venetians were trying to fabricate a claim in the Americas, having a fictional prince in charge of the expedition may not be a bad thing at all, as long as no one knew he was fake. The prince in this scenario becomes some unknown ruler of an unknown land that conveniently can't make this into a claim for the same land Venice wanted. In short, all the clues are so tantalizing because they can be interpreted in multiple ways, and nothing is definitive. They're intriguing, but far from conclusive, and each can be interpreted in more mundane ways. One point in favor of plausibility is that a transatlantic voyage in the late 14th century was not impossible. The Norse had already shown that by sailing to Greenland and Newfoundland centuries earlier, by Sinclair's time, ships and navigation, especially with experienced sailors like the Zeno brothers, if that part were true, could potentially make the journey. Sinclair, as Lord Admiral of Scotland, certainly had command of ships and crews. So physically, a voyage from Orkney to Nova Scotia could be within reach, following the Viking route via Iceland and Greenland. Further, it's important to remember that Orkney was essentially a Norse holdout at this point, and the idea of a land beyond Greenland existing was known within that culture. That said, it's not clear if the people on Orkney or Shetland at the time factually knew this or not, though it was broadly known to the culture. It's also worth noting that the legend doesn't claim Sinclair colonized or profoundly changed the New World, only that he visited and left. This means there wouldn't necessarily be a huge historical footprint. In terms of feasibility, then, the Sinclair voyage is not as far-fetched as other pre-Columbian trips across the Atlantic. Despite the above point, virtually all historians and scholars categorize the Henry Sinclair voyage as a fringe theory due to the scant and unreliable evidence. And yet, the legend persists and continues to fascinate. People want to believe that a noble knight-errant beat Columbus to America and perhaps carried with him secret knowledge or treasure. But as historians often note, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And so far, the Henry Sinclair legend has supplied plenty of extraordinary claims, but very little hard proof. In the end, whether Henry Sinclair truly set foot in North America in 1398 remains unproven. Historically, we must conclude that the Henry Sinclair voyage to North America isn't supported by solid evidence and is considered implausible based on the present facts. But we also should acknowledge that it's a real possibility and keep our minds open to analyzing future evidence with an open mind. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to click that like button, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also remember to check out the YouTube membership or the Patreon if you want to support my channel and my work further. As the midnight hush blanketed the Tennessee wilderness, 2 gunshots rang out from a lonely inn along the Natchez Trace on October 11th, 1809. When dawn broke, America's famed explorer Meriwether Lewis was found mortally wounded, bleeding from gunshot wounds to the head and chest. Just 3 years earlier, Lewis had returned as a national hero from an epic journey across the uncharted West. Now, at only 35 years old, he lay dead under mysterious circumstances. Until this day, historians still debate whether his demise was the final act of a troubled soul or the bloody deed of an unknown assailant. Born in Virginia in 1774, Meriwether Lewis was an American explorer, soldier, and politician, best known for his role as leader of the Lewis and Clark expedition. From a young age, Lewis proved himself an outdoorsman with keen survival skills on the frontier. He served in the militia and U.S. Army, where he gained leadership experience on the western frontier. In 1701, President Thomas Jefferson, a family friend, chose the 27-year-old Lewis to serve as his personal secretary in the president's house. Jefferson soon tapped Lewis to command an ambitious mission that would make him one of history's great explorers. Lewis recruited his former Army comrade William Clark as co-captain, and together they prepared to venture into the vast unknown lands recently acquired by the United States. In May 1804, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark set off from St. Louis at the head of the Corps of Discovery. This was a team of about 40 people tasked with exploring the Louisiana Purchase and beyond. Over the next 2.5 years, the expedition traveled nearly 8,000 miles through wilderness, traversing the Great Plains, over the Rocky Mountains, and all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And once they got to the Pacific, they turned around and did it all over again. Along the journey, Lewis and his team mapped uncharted rivers and mountains and made contact with many Native American tribes, securing peaceable relations and gathering information. Their successful trek proved that overland travel to the Pacific was possible and helped ignite America's vision of manifest destiny. Lewis returned to St. Louis in September 1806 as a celebrated hero of discovery. He and Clark were hailed for their courage and achievements, and few figures loomed larger in the American imagination than these 2 figures. Lewis's life after the expedition, however, was far from the victorious glory one might imagine. In 1707, President Jefferson rewarded his protege by appointing Lewis governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory, a vast jurisdiction based in St. Louis. At just 33, Lewis suddenly had heavy administrative responsibilities on the frontier. He tried to carry out Jefferson's vision in the territory, publishing laws, establishing roads, and negotiating with various Native American tribes. However, Lewis struggled in his new role, and he ended up in conflict with his own administration, and he even faced allegations of misappropriating government funds. Because of these allegations, one governmental department refused to reimburse him for money he had paid out for governmental tasks, leaving him crushed financially. He ended up heavily in debt, and creditors demanded their money, forcing him to liquidate land he'd earned for his expedition service. By 1809, the once renowned explorer was facing ruinous debt and a damaged reputation. Lewis also failed to produce the edited journals of the expedition for publication, a task Jefferson eagerly awaited. The pressure of that unfinished work weighed on him, and he struggled with loneliness and ill health. He never married or found lasting love, and some accounts suggest he struggled with addiction. Friends grew concerned as Lewis reportedly cycled between intense bouts of energy and dark periods of depression. One month he would be highly expansive and productive, and the next month he would be virtually unable to function. Even Thomas Jefferson noted that Lewis's family had a history of quote-unquote hypochondriac affections, a term now generally understood to describe the ups and downs of bipolar disorder. All of these troubles set the stage for a journey that Lewis hoped would solve his problems, but which instead led to his tragic end. By September 1709, Meriwether Lewis decided to travel to Washington, D.C. to straighten out his affairs. He planned to personally appeal the government's refusal to pay his bills and clear his name of any wrongdoing. He also carried his precious expedition journals, intending to finally get them into the hands of a publisher. Lewis departed St. Louis on September 4th, 1809, accompanied by his personal servant, a free African-American man named John Pernia. Initially, Lewis intended to take a riverboat south to New Orleans and catch a ship to Washington. However, en route, rumors of a conflict with Britain made him fear that traveling by sea could be risky. He couldn't bear the thought of British forces seizing his journals if war broke out. This would have been, in essence, a national security nightmare, and would have given the British a massive advantage on the West Coast and the Great Plains region. Thus, he altered his plans and opted for an overland route via the Natchez Trace, the old frontier road through the wilderness from Mississippi up to Nashville. This route was notoriously dangerous. The Natchez Trace was plagued by highwaymen who preyed on travelers. Aware of the risks, Lewis even wrote his will before setting out. Lewis reached Fort Pickering, near present-day Memphis, by river on September 15th, 1809. There, witnesses began to sense something was amiss in the explorer's state of mind. The captain of the boat that brought Lewis downriver later reported that Lewis had been acting strangely during the trip. He noted that at one point Lewis was suffering what was described as a quote-unquote mental derangement. Fort Pickering's commander detained Lewis for several days until he seemed to recover his senses. On September 29th, Lewis left Fort Pickering to continue overland on the Natchez Trace, now traveling with Major James Neely. It didn't take long for Lewis's companions to observe his disturbed frame of mind returning. According to one account, Lewis again appeared, quote, deranged shortly after leaving the fort. Clearly, the governor was under severe psychological strain as he pushed deeper into the lonely frontier. By early October, the party was making its way through the thick forests of Tennessee. On October 10th, 1809, Meriwether Lewis arrived at a remote roadside inn known as Grinder's Stand, about 70 miles southwest of Nashville along the Natchez Trace. Because Major Neely had fallen behind, delayed to round up some stray horses. Lewis came to the inn with just his servant John Pernia and Neely's servant as companions. The inn was a crude log cabin outfit run by Robert Grinder and his wife Priscilla. Mr. Grinder was away, but Mrs. Grinder offered lodging. She gave Lewis the use of a small cabin room, while the two servants stayed in the stable, and she and her children slept in a separate kitchen building a short distance away. Accounts agree that Lewis was agitated and behaving oddly on the evening of October 10th. Mrs. Grinder later said that during dinner, Lewis stood and paced the room, talking to himself as if arguing points in a speech or legal case, his face flushed with emotion. He eventually retired to his room, but throughout the night the innkeeper's wife could hear him continuing to murmur and talk to himself in a passionate, unsettled tone. Sometime in the pre-dawn hours of October 11th, the quiet darkness was pierced by the sound of a shot. According to Mrs. Grinder, she heard multiple shots, a scuffle, and a cry for help from Lewis's cabin. Frightened, she didn't immediately rush over. By one report, she peered out to see the wounded Lewis crawling on hands and knees back into his room. After that, things ended up getting even more unusual. Despite seeing and hearing what she saw, she did nothing until morning, which some sources call an inexplicable action. To interject my own personal view, we've already established that she was operating a small roadside inn in a lawless part of the country, and her husband was away. If Lewis was indeed attacked that night, it seems likely that her going out to confront the assailants may have simply led to more violence that night. At first light, Mrs. Grinder sent her children to find the servants. John Pernia and the other man ran to the cabin to discover Meriwether Lewis sprawled on the floor, bleeding profusely from 2 wounds, one in his head and one in his abdomen. Incredibly, Lewis was still clinging to life, though barely. He was conscious enough to speak a few words where he spoke incoherently, apparently stating that he wasn't a coward, but that he had to die. Over the next hour or two, Meriwether Lewis bled out on a buffalo robe, and by sunrise, the great explorer was dead. Lewis's sudden death was a devastating shock to those who heard the news. He had been only 35 years old, and seemingly on the cusp of resolving his troubles. Major Neely arrived at Grinder's stand later on October 11th and was tasked with the grim duty of handling the remains. In the absence of formal clergy or family, Neely had Lewis's body buried near the inn, just a few hundred yards from the spot where he died. There was no ceremony, a tragic, quiet end for a national hero. Neely wrote to President Jefferson a week later, informing him that his friend had done this to himself. News of Lewis's death traveled slowly by word of mouth and letters, but when it reached the wider public, it was often sensationalized. A Nashville newspaper printed a lurid account claiming to know all the gory details of what happened. Other papers around the country reprinted and embellished the story. From the very start, the facts of what happened in that lonely cabin were muddled by hearsay and speculation. No one had actually seen Lewis fire the fatal shots, and the only supposed witness, Mrs. Priscilla Grinder, gave conflicting stories over time about what she heard and did that night. According to various secondhand versions of Mrs. Grinder's testimony, her accounts differed on key details. In one version, she described hearing Lewis arguing loudly with himself, and then the shots, after which he staggered wounded from his room, pleading for help before collapsing. In another version, she claimed that before the shooting, she heard voices of other men and a commotion as if strangers had confronted Lewis. Yet Mrs. Grinder never wrote any statement down, and by the time others recorded her story, details had changed. This inconsistency has led some to suspect that her testimony was fabricated or at the very least unreliable. Meanwhile, The physical evidence was troubling. Lewis had 2 wounds, one in the head and one in the chest, yet somehow lived for a short time after. In addition, the money Lewis had carried, borrowed to fund his travel, was missing when his body was found. Missing funds and the dangerous reputation of the Natchez Trace fueled whispers that Lewis might have been ambushed by highwaymen. The area was indeed known for bandits who wouldn't hesitate to end the lives of travelers. However, neither of the 2 servants present reported seeing any intruders that night. All we have are the eerie echoes of shots in the dark and a handful of inconsistent recollections. In keeping with frontier law, a local magistrate convened a brief coroner's inquest on Lewis's body shortly after his death. They're believed to have found no evidence of foul play. Unfortunately, the written report from this 1809 inquest was later lost, so we don't know their exact conclusions or reasoning. There's actually a major hiccup in the case related to this initial inquest, though, and I'll circle back to that in a moment. Lewis's family back in Virginia was horrified at the suggestion that Merriweather would have done it to himself. His mother and relatives flatly believed he had been slain, suspecting either his servant Pernia or unknown robbers as the culprits. Governor Lewis's family, concerned with his legacy, found it hard to accept that a man of such stature could succumb to such an act, which in those days carried an extreme stigma. By contrast, Lewis's close friends and colleagues, including William Clark and Thomas Jefferson, had little doubt that Lewis perished due to his own acts. Upon receiving the tragic news, Jefferson wrote that Lewis had a, quote, constitutional disposition toward depression and had experienced several severe depressive episodes before. The former president sadly concluded that his friend became deranged and did it to himself. Clark, too, knew of Lewis's prior emotional struggles and accepted the official explanation, grieving that the weight of his comrade's mind had overcome him. Over time, the death of Meriwether Lewis evolved into one of early America's great historical mysteries, with the 2 positions being cemented almost immediately. The theory that he did it himself hinges on his pre-existing psychological issues, which were exacerbated by his deep financial troubles. Further, he was keen on drinking, and was also known to heavily engage in the use of laudanum, further factors which could have pushed him over the metaphorical edge. Notably, one modern hypothesis suggests he had contracted malaria during his many travels, and late-stage malaria can cause dementia, delirium, and depressive episodes. Another theory claims he might have had syphilis, which in advanced stages can lead to severe neurological and psychological symptoms. Whatever the exact cause, proponents of this theory paint a picture of a man in deep despair who unfortunately felt like he had no options left. Yet, despite the strong case that he did it himself, doubts have lingered from the beginning. Critics asked from the beginning why Mrs. Grinder didn't investigate immediately if she heard Lewis pleading for help. Her contradictory statements have led some to wonder if she concealed knowledge of other individuals at the scene. In the most extreme form, some have suggested that this inn was actually a trap, and that the Grinders were working in conjunction with local bandits. Under this theory, most of the time, the inn was a perfectly legitimate institution for travelers passing through. However, when a traveler came through with a significant amount of wealth, the Grinders would tip off local highwaymen that they'd landed a big fish in their net. Under usual circumstances, the highwaymen would then accost the traveler after stalking them beyond the inn, so as not to raise suspicions. However, according to this theory, some believe greed may have taken hold quickly, and they couldn't wait. John Pernia, Lewis's servant, also comes under the microscope in some theories. Lewis's own mother reportedly suspected this servant might have slain her son for money and fled. People who believe Pernia was responsible claim that he perished by his own hand a few years later. However, all that the official records note is that he died of a laudanum overdose in 1810, which may very well have been accidental. Some theorists have speculated about political motives for the slaying, suggesting perhaps someone wanted Lewis silenced. One angle involved General James Wilkinson or other officials who might have been implicated in financial scandals. Notably, Wilkinson was known to be a scandalous individual during his lifetime, but the true bombshell about the man didn't come until well after his death. In 1854, he was revealed to have been a Spanish spy and had actually spent his life directly acting against American interests. That said, despite this, there's no hard evidence to suggest that Lewis was eliminated on the orders of Wilkinson, though it is theoretically possible. One intriguing piece of historical evidence favoring this hypothesis came decades after Lewis's death. In 1848, Tennessee officials undertook to locate Lewis's neglected grave and erect a proper monument. When they partially exhumed his remains, the examining doctor and commission members were struck by what they saw. The official report noted that while everyone had assumed Lewis committed the act himself, they found that his skull had received damage that wasn't explained. The report concluded that it was probable that he had been slain, but given the passage of time, they couldn't offer anything further in the way of analysis. This startling conclusion by a state commission 39 years after the fact gave the theory a kind of early forensic boost. In 1996, a coroner's jury in Lewis County, Tennessee, even recommended exhumation, reasoning that modern science might finally resolve the case. However, because the grave lies on National Park Service land, federal permission was required. The Department of the Interior initially approved the exhumation in 2008, then reversed the decision in 2010. They cited concerns about disturbing the pioneer cemetery around the grave and a desire to let Lewis rest in peace. To this day, the remains haven't been exhumed, and the exact cause of Lewis's death remains unconfirmed. More than 2 centuries later, the death of Meriwether Lewis remains an evocative mystery at the intersection of American history and true crime. On one hand, the evidence of Lewis's inner demons presents a compelling case that this legendary explorer perhaps took that irrevocable act in an extremely dark moment. On the other hand, the unresolved quirks of that October night leave lingering doubt that foul play could have occurred. Perhaps one day the federal government will allow his remains to be exhumed, and maybe, just maybe, we'll see the end of this more than 2 centuries old mystery in our lifetimes.